Hello to everyone. My name is Hildy Gottlieb. I am with Creating the Future. And if you all could just say who you are and where you're beaming in from, and we'll get going. So again, I'm Hildy Gottlieb. I'm with Creating the Future. I am in Tucson, Arizona, where it is expected to be beyond hot today. We will leave it at that. It will be around 110 Fahrenheit, which is about 7 million Celsius. You can check that. Angie, where are you coming in? Who are you, and where are you coming in from?
Hi, I'm Angie Icaberry. I'm in Omaha, Nebraska, where it's actually not too bad today. It was terrible yesterday, but the storm came through and cooled things off. So it's the windows are actually open, which has been a long time since this happened. It's good to see everyone.
Wonderful, wonderful, wonderful. I will speak for Dimitri, who is trying to get everything working. He is also in Tucson, Arizona. For those who are curious about his phenomenal background, he's really right there. So the power of Zoom. Vu, hello to you.
Good morning, everyone, or good evening, Carl. I am in Seattle, Washington, close to San Juan Island, and it's very nice here. It's 80 degrees Fahrenheit or 500 degrees Celsius.
I'm telling you. And the man who lives by Celsius, Carl.
Hi everyone, I'm Carl. I'm in a place called St Albans, which those of you that know the UK is just outside London, about 20 miles outside London. It is unusually hot for Britain at the moment. So in Fahrenheit, I believe it's 95 degrees, which for us sort of folk, is like we're just not used to it. So I am very, very hot.
Yeah. Yeah, and you are breaking up a little bit, just to let you know, Carl, in terms of bandwidth. Just to let you know. And Justin.
Right, okay.
Justin Pollock.
I am Justin. I'm beaming in from the national capital of Crazyville, which would be Washington, D.C. I actually feel for you, Carl. So at least the heat that we have here, and even the heat that Hildy is talking about, is not out of the realm of pseudo-normal, whereas what you're experiencing is truly crazy for where you are. So
Yeah. We have a couple of folks. I know that Amanda has gone offline right now. She was hanging out and having some technical problems, and Mary Lorette Gallo also was saying that she is having internet problems, phone service down, and she is in the San Juan Islands in Washington State, and saying that she will go to the blog and hopefully we will be streaming by then. But welcome to everyone. If you are able to watch, if you are streaming, please tweet to the hashtag Creating the Future. And that is where we will be watching for things on our phones as we go through. And again, that hashtag is Creating the Future. We start all our meetings by just connecting with each other to say what has been awesome and powerful in our lives since we last saw each other. And so, Amanda, can you hear us?
Yes.
And we can hear you. Tell us who you are and where you're beaming in from.
Hi, my name is Amanda Schrager, and I'm beaming in from Tucson, Arizona. Awesome.
Awesome.
Yeah.
Where it is also anticipated to be 2 million degrees, both Fahrenheit and Celsius today.
Yes. I'll be camped out in the home office all day.
Wonderful, wonderful, wonderful. We start all our meetings by connecting with each other as humans and just sharing a little bit about what has been awesome in our lives since we last saw each other. And awesome can be great, awesome can be powerful, meaningful. And so if anybody wants to jump in terms of what has been awesome since we last saw each other. And I just have to say that we have been having these meetings and have been starting with Awesomes since 2011, 2012. And I love the fact that every time I invite folks to dive in and say what's been awesome in their lives, we all act like I've never asked that question before. And oh, I have no idea. So wonderful, Carl, got your note, and we will see you on there. And so anybody jump on in, and what's been awesome? What's going on with your life?
I'll jump in. So Friday, we just picked up our daughters who had been actually away at sleepaway camp for a month. That we had done the whole, 2-week quarantine before they went, tests to make sure we were all negative for COVID, to sort of introduce them into a bubble up in upstate New York or Pennsylvania, and it worked. So we took that calculated risk, and it's just really nice to hear stories of our kids having kid moments.
That is awesome. That is very awesome.
Of course, now they're home, and we're having to deal with kids being home again.
A month without kids is an awfully nice thing. We don't like to say that, but it is. Who else?
I'll jump in. We just got back from a second trip to the Black Hills because we had so much fun the first time we went back again, and we also figured out a way, I think mostly to do it to not be, exposed. So it is possible, I guess. So I guess the awesome is being able to get away and have some downtime, and also I guess the ability to try to figure out how to, make things work in a different environment is, in a way, empowering. But also, well, all the rest that's happening still around us. So anyway, I'm gonna hold on to this time as the semester gets going and things get especially crazy.
Awesome, wonderful. Sounds heart stuff. Boo, what's been going on with you? What is awesome and powerful for you?
Hi everyone. The community-centric fundraising has been building momentum since we launched it to really talk about the way we do fundraising in the sector needs to change completely, and it seems to be resonating with people. It's very exciting. It's a little overwhelming because the movement versus being an organization has been very interesting because it's not something I'm used to. So I'm used to the hierarchical model of being on top and being everyone just listening. And that has been kind of a shift, and I think it's actually pretty amazing and awesome just to see how this spread across the sector.
Very cool. Very cool. Yeah, you have the great good fortune of starting out that way. We're going to be talking in a little bit about the fact that Creating the Future started as a regular organization, and we're making that shift. So yeah, you guys are starting out experimenting, and I am so excited to learn from everything that you're experiencing. Just very cool. Amanda, tell us something that's been cool and groovy in your life.
Well, I work at KXCI Community Radio here in Tucson, so I'm involved with our fundraising and our operations. So, I've been stalking View for a few years, maybe about 7, and following what you do too, Hildy, a little bit less so. And I was just on a Zoom call last week where my audio worked, with about 100 people involved with non-commercial radio, some of them small stations, some of the big stations, and looking at looking at stations who aren't tightly affiliated, and being loosely affiliated, and how stations can use their platform to do anti-racism work.
Wow.
And so that felt really great. There were, a couple of people, one radio programmer from Oakland who also who value and knew about, but then many other people who I didn't already know about. So that's kind of neat.
Very cool. Very cool. Carl is just connecting here. Dimitri, do you want to share an awesome or?
Had an amazing week.
I will unmute and you can process.
Yes, my awesome is had an amazing week that culminated in a drive through Monument Valley. And neither of us had ever been to Monument Valley before. And there were so many layers of wonderful and amazing and incredible, including the fact that we were on the Navajo reservation and watching what they're doing to deal with COVID. So it was a very multifaceted experience, but not the least of which was spending many hours with mouth agape going, wow, that's beautiful, that's amazing, I can't believe that, and took tons and tons of pictures. So that's my most immediate top of mind awesome that I want to share. Mm-hmm.
For those who are new to Dimitri and Hildy being in the same room, we can't both be on or the reverb happens. And so if there's a pause, you'll understand why. Carl, what's been going on that's powerful, meaningful, fun, exciting in your life?
Well, today's the first day of my summer holiday. So that feels pretty awesome for me because if I'm honest, everyone, I'm absolutely shattered. It's been a really, really tough, well, sort of it's more than 4 months now, isn't it? We've been sort of going through the COVID stuff for 5 months sort of least. But I guess what's sort of amazing for me is that, I've had brilliant people around me who have helped me in a very difficult period. And the fact that they said to me on Friday, we want you to go away and we'll be offended if you look at your emails. That's been amazing. The fact that they're giving me the space and time to just sort of disappear for a couple of weeks.
The work you all have been doing is incredible. I read every blog post. If you have not seen, and I'm going to be posting this a lot, Carl did something like a 15, 16 tweet thread noting blog post after blog post of the detail and beautifully, vulnerably open, transparent of how NCVO has been doing their work in this area. And it was, it's really moving. And you can see how hard it was, how tough it was. And I'm just admiring the hell out of you for all you guys have done. And yeah, it's been pretty awesome.
There's quite a serious point here, Hildy, which, 99% of it is not me. It's my colleagues.
Yep.
But the 1% that is me, these conversations that we have, in this board and the spirit in which we hold them, and the conversations that we've had ever since I told you all I was first thinking of sort of going for the chief exec job, so much of what you've told me has helped me on that journey. So I wanted to say thank you to you all.
Okay. Wonderful, wonderful, wonderful. My awesome is, there's a million of them. There were a million awesomes before we left for vacation. The fact that we have this wonderful article now at Stanford Social Innovation Review sharing, pardon me, what catalytic thinking is and how it works. Oh, I apologize. And then the fact that Dimitri and I actually escaped for over a week. His brothers got a cabin in Colorado so that we could feel safe. We didn't have to worry about being in a hotel. I don't camp, so that was not an option, Angie. Unless there's camping that includes makeup and a hairdryer, I don't do it. But it was so beautiful to wake up in the morning. It was so cool, and sit on the back porch surrounded by pine trees and not have to have a cogent thought for over a week. That was just delicious. It was just absolutely delicious. And it was, as Dimitri mentioned, Monument Valley. Neither of us, I've been in Tucson for over 40 years. Dimitri was born here. Neither of us had ever been. And it is everything you've ever seen pictures of and then some. It's powerful. It was also really powerful being on the res for that long. And some of you know, Dimitri and I spent over 10 years doing economic development work with Southwestern tribes. And being on the reservation, you're driving for hours. Navajo is huge, and to get from where we were to where to home was, it was 4 or 5 hours on the res during COVID. And you know, this entire 200,000 people completely ignored by our government, and are suffering the worst of anywhere in the country per capita. And they actually curfewed. They from Friday night to Monday morning shut down everything on the reservation to keep people safe. Everything from gas stations to McDonald's to, you know, so not just governments, to everything. The whole reservation was on curfew. And there were just layers and layers of powerful in that I am still working on unpacking. It's just, it's big. It's just big. So yeah, it was a really, just a good, wonderful, moving experience on all kinds of levels, sitting by waterfalls and just going, oh. That was kind of nice. So that is what has been awesome here. And again, if you are watching, if we've got the stream up and you want to share who you are, where you are, and tweet to Creating the Future, the hashtag Creating the Future, and we will keep an eye out for you. Tell us where you are, tell us what's been awesome in your life, and we will dive in now to get things going here. We're going to be starting a conversation about racial equity, which we started a little bit last time, dove into just enough to say we don't have time to dive into it, and starting that conversation using catalytic thinking. If you go to the blog post that has this meeting, you will find 2 different links that can help you if you're not familiar with catalytic thinking. And I will just bring them up on the screen right now so that you can see what they look like, but those will help you understand what we're talking about. One of them looks like this. It is a graphic depiction of the framework. Some people think best in pictures. We will start with this whole column here on the left, talking about all of the various people who will be impacted by our conversation, whether they are the, quote, target audience of the population of the conversation or not, because we know that people will be impacted regardless of whether we are aiming there or not. And then we will reach for what these conversations can make possible. The other link that you will see at the website, if you go there, is for those who think best in text. Page 2 of this is actually the order of the questions that we'll be asking. So if that is helpful to you, those 2 links are at the blog post for this meeting. All righty. I want to just give a little bit of a preface, and then Justin had offered to facilitate this conversation, which I'm grateful for. One of the things that is, and what I wanted to do is just give a little bit of context to folks who are not familiar. I mean, the board is really familiar with where we are evolution-wise as an organization. or to the point view as an organization becoming more and more movement-like. But I wanted to make clear to folks who are not familiar, give you a little bit of context. Creating the Future is right now at a crossroads, at a turning point. We are, and have been for about a year, at the place of moving from a small, founder-driven, almost entirely, I shouldn't say almost entirely volunteer-driven with tiny stipends to folks who are either teaching or doing the day-to-day work, but almost an entirely volunteer-driven, founder-driven proof of concept stage. And we are at that crossroads where we are about to raise a lot of money and invest in what does it take to have our mission scale globally so that everyone is asking questions that bring out the best in each other and that systems actually change. And so this conversation is really, 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 really important for our future. It's important to understand where we've been, but it is so, I mean, we are at this critical point right now where we could not be having a more important conversation. So I just wanted to sort of give that as background so that we're all sort of on the same page. A lot of what the board has been doing for the past several years is putting the infrastructure in place structurally. What is our board? What is this organization if we're going to be movement-like, which is what you have to be to ripple a concept like this. And so we're in a wonderful place to be having the conversation. And I just wanted to give that little bit of context and hand it over to you, Justin.
Great, thank you, Hildy. Well, so I want to just invite everybody in that, you know, one of the things, and again, this is less for the board here, but other people who might see this is the appreciation that sometimes we get really bogged down in process and sometimes we don't give attention to process the way we need to. And I think in our conversation from the last board meeting, particularly around this area of looking at racial justice and equity, and the idea of starting a conversation around it, we, and I know myself in particular, there was a pause because I think we wanted to make sure we were giving attention to what a successful conversation about this even looks like before we start jumping to what do we need to do, what are the actions that we need to take. I know for me personally, it comes from both observing, being a part of, and hearing about conversations that go wrong, particularly around equity and racial justice. And so, again, for folks sort of external to this, that's part of where we're coming to for this conversation, is to ask that question of us going into this conversation, having a conversation about what racial equity, racial justice looks like in relationship to creating the future, how it needs to be present. We wanted to first ask ourselves that conversation in and of itself, whom is affected by it, in what ways, and what are the beneficial outcomes that we want to have of the conversation, and for those people that are involved. So again, I set that up for context, less for the people here, because you've been part of that conversation, or conversations like this. So that's actually where I wanted to start, was as we all think about, you know, stepping into this space. And I know many of us are having these conversations in other places too, so I want to acknowledge that. But as we think about having this conversation for creating the future with everyone that's connected, first and foremost, whom is potentially affected by us having this conversation? What is that list for folks?
Well, I will start with us as a board, us as just the people on the screen here, a board and community members who are going to be part of the conversation.
Whom else should we be thinking about having in our minds that are folks who are ultimately affected by the way in which and how we have this conversation.
So Justin, if I can come here. One of the things that's been a real struggle for me over these past months as I've been looking at these issues is the more I read, the more I've read about, and I'm sorry, there isn't a way to sugarcoat this. The more I've read that white middle-class people have taken over the voluntary sector. And one of my intrinsic nervousness is about having this conversation is the makeup of our board and the fact that it is predominantly, I presume, middle-class, white, straight, able-bodied people that are sort of having this conversation. And we are having this conversation about predominantly rather than with or amongst, if that's the sort of the right language. And one of the things that has been sort of drummed into me, and I do understand this, but I mean, it's a hard conversation for us to have, is the extent to which we are centering ourselves in this conversation by talking about us and what this board will do, rather than centering other people in the conversation. So in as much as this is a conversation about us, it strikes me that it's a conversation about allyship and for the majority of us about how to be good allies. And I mean, I thought I sort of was beginning to understand that, but I will hold my hand up and say I'm not sure I do actually.
You're not alone.
Sorry, I don't, that's a negative way to start. But.
No.
Well, I think as I reflect on what you said, Carl, that as we engage, because Hildy, you mentioned, sort of that first audience is us, each one of us as participants in this, and I would like to echo. So if we sort of jump to, what are some potential beneficial outcomes? What can this make possible? I think figuring out how we have a conversation that is really aware of how we center things. I think being very, very, like, I want to be in this conversation. I want to increase my own awareness of that process and thinking about how I can work actively, I think, in that allyship of, even as a white cisgendered male, middle-aged with some gray hair, what does it look like to navigate through that with intentionality and have that top of mind.
So Justin, could I just sort of come back to that, and I may be about to make my first mistake in front of everybody. One of the things that I really like about what Vu writes is that he talks about how so much about social change has been over-intellectualized, and that sometimes we just need to like get on with stuff and do it. And one of the things that I found most difficult about all of these conversations when I've been involved in them is that I'm quite a practical person. And I just want to do stuff because I want to change the world. I'm no different to anyone else on the board. And I struggle between, on the one hand, wanting to just get on and do stuff, as sort of Vu writes, and then on the other hand, there's this sort of, I was reading something the other day about one of the characteristics of white supremacy in organizations is this rush to judgment and to accuse people of over-intellectualizing things and so on. So what I want out of this, what for me would be a good outcome, is sort of some sort of language whereby we feel more comfortable talking about it, because one of the characteristics of these conversations for me is the struggle to find the appropriate language and the fear of saying the wrong thing all the time.
Carl, what that's making me think of is to go back to what I started with, the participants in the conversation. A couple things. One, people are going to be watching this, so it is also, they are in essence participants, so they are listed in the for whom's. But I want to go back and restate my participants in the conversation, because we're not all, as participants, coming from the same lens. We're coming from different gender lenses, we're coming from different ethnicity lenses, we're coming from a whole bunch of different lenses. And I think each of us is, so when we're talking about how to have the conversation, what we want the conversation alone to make possible, I think that's going to be very, very different for each of us, based on age, based on ability, based on sexuality, based on gender, based, I mean, everything. But we're all different. Coming from, or maybe not all, but many of us are coming from very, very different lenses and experiencing even just being on the board as through different lenses.
So I want to kind of continue down this path of us, since we are sort of that first of the concentric circles. Because Carl, you opened it up sort of thinking about, for this conversation to be successful, this is what I need to be aware of, this is what I would like to get out of it. For others, since you are all participants, you're here, you will be participants in this ongoing conversation. What else are you hoping that this conversation makes possible for you individually? What is it that you're hoping to be able to benefit? And I want to be careful with the language, because I know for me, the benefit can still be challenging and painful. Like for me, one of the benefits is I want to learn. And I was actually just in a meeting that we were talking about learning, and that learning forces you to see something different than you've seen it in the past. That's part, if there isn't a difference, if there isn't a change, there isn't a learning, there's just an affirmation. And so I want to learn, and I recognize, I think, Carl, to your point, and you sort of referenced and made me think of the Jay Smoot YouTube or TED Talk, if any of you have had a chance to see that. Vu, I know you've mentioned it before. He talks about having racism in your teeth, that we need to figure out how to have real conversations that people accept and also feel comfortable being uncomfortable. And it's okay, and we don't want to hide from it. So I want to be challenged to learn, to understand how to have these conversations. Like I want our conversation to help me understand, Carl, some of what you were talking about, how to be an ally, how to be present in a conversation like this. I'm gonna stop there. For others.
Yeah, can I add, I agree with all those things that you said. And then also I'm thinking about my role, for example, as an instructor, right? I have students, and so I'm trying to do a better job of first educating myself, and upsetting the sort of systems that have privilege, that given me privilege and not giving privileges to other people, and then translating that, or helping, also playing a role in helping my students to think about those issues. And so that's kind of part of all this too, and doing it in a way that's not going to actually cause more problems than try to solve or not reinforce systems, but try to upset systems further.
one of the things that I'm thinking about, and it becomes another for whom, just like Angie, your students is another for whom, who will be impacted by whatever conversation we have. I'm thinking so much about all of the future people who will be working with for creating the future. So as we grow, I'm thinking about growing wisely and growing as inclusively as possible, and what that means. What are we putting in place to make sure that as we grow beyond the two white old people that started this thing, what do we put in place? What structures do we put in place to best ensure that people feel safe and heard, and that we move beyond? I guess that's a big piece for me. What does it take to have a conversation where an organization moves beyond having to have conversations about what it means to be safe, where people just feel, I'm here and I'm part of this, and I feel this is family and part of it, rather than having to have a conversation. I don't know that I'm being clear about it, but I'm sort of thinking about what does a future look like for this organization if we don't have to have this conversation. And so to me, I keep thinking about because I'm so embedded in building the future of creating the future. I'm not sure I'm being clear.
Well, I think you are, but I'm wondering about one, do we want to strive to a place where we don't continue to have this conversation because of the long history of oppression? Like, this is going to be a long-term thing, right? And also that maybe do we want to create safe spaces for people? Because, I mean, there have been plenty of people who have not had those safe spaces for various reasons. And I mean, who are we providing the safe spaces for? Because as a white person, probably I need to not be in safe spaces. I need to be challenged. I need to be uncomfortable, right? And so, yeah, anyway, those are some reflections on what you were saying.
And I like I said, I'm not sure I'm clarifying what's in my head, but I really am thinking so much about what we're building, and that those future people we've not met yet, that are deeply part of the work that Creating the Future is doing, that they are part of the for whoms. They are part of the people who will absolutely be impacted by this conversation.
And the organizations that we are all sort of part of in relation to Creating the Future and outside Creating the Future, or in partnership with.
I'm thinking about and Hildy, I know you said you were not feeling like you were articulating quite clearly, and but I think similar to Angie, there is sort of a response that there was a reaction I had, which is yeah, this false sense of like finality that we get somewhere, because I don't know that really exists. This is social relationship. It's like, we don't say you get married and then you got your relationship. Like, you got there and we shouldn't have to talk about being married anymore. I really do. I think actually, as a participant in the conversation, again, I think that was part of where I was wanting to become better at the conversation, is because I want to be able to understand how the conversation needs to continue to happen. What are the questions, so again, drawing on Creating the Future, it's not oftentimes it's not the prescription of the solution, it's the prescription of the question. What's the question that we have to keep asking ourselves and keep revisiting, so that we can understand, have we figured out what it really takes? And so I think that I want to see, so there is the general understanding that what do we mean by racial justice and racial equity, and making sure that there's a human-centered, really broad understanding that, I think, as Carl was saying, I don't want it to be our definition. I want to know what's the world saying racial justice and racial equity are. I want to make sure that we're in alignment with that, not our own interpretation of it. So that was one, but I want to know that we're asking questions, just like we say, are we financially sound? Are we racially justice and equity sound? Are we, I mean, I want it to be just up there, the same, the same criteria that we use for judging success in other operational. I want us to have the language and I want our conversation to lead to systems that codify that. I think that's probably what I should say. Again, other thoughts about what we want to see as the outcomes, what we want our engagement in pursuing conversations around, coming to understanding, implementing a lens of racial justice and equity into creating the future. What other possibilities do we want?
I just need to say I am moved by the word relationship. I appreciate your marriage analogy, and really just one of the things that struck me, Carl, when you were talking about that dichotomy, that push and pull of getting down to business, and instead the process of having the conversations. Having worked with some indigenous groups over time, the thing that was striking is the degree to which relationship is the start of the conversation. We did some work. We were doing a class once, an immersion class in New Zealand, and folks there do a lot of work with the Māori population. And we spent the first half day, any of you who've been through our immersion courses know, we would spend the first half day of 5 days just getting to know each other. And what we were told is if you walked into a Māori setting for a meeting and the focus initially was not on building relationship, that you would be discounted. That you'd just be the white outsider and doing the getting down to business thing, and by the end of the day, half the people would have left. And so that building relationship piece is just really striking to me, Justin. That it is, we've pulled it out of how we work when it's the only thing that matters. So what does that mean? So I just wanted to say that's really striking for me. Thank you.
After about 45 minutes of wrestling with audio, I'm here, and but it's probably actually a really good metaphor for me to listen much more than I speak anyhow. So, but I want to just bring up, recognize you all, myself included, feeling uncomfortable, and just feeling comfortable with feeling uncomfortable, and have that be okay. And it's not, this work isn't just for your group. This work is for you and your personal selves and your well-being and the interactions with people that you have in your community. It's a way of life. It's not like, how can this group that I'm in do anti-racist work? It's like, do I have friends that are people of color? Like, do I, like, and this is kind of, that's I want to really highlight a couple of people in Tucson, John Peter Wilhite and Julie Ragland. I've definitely taken a few courses from them and got some guidance on them. Like, I can't just diversify the KXCI board by going to the Black people I know and saying like, hey, would you like, or don't know, and say, hey, would you like to be on our board? Like, I need to be in dialogue with people, with many kinds of people in an organic way. And again, to just start where I am and keep on going.
Hey everyone, this is Vu. Apologies, I'm not holding out by not speaking. I'm a writer and I need lots of time to think before I speak. I'm sorry, I'm just gonna process and ramble on for a second on. So my apologies in advance. I do think, speaking as a person of color, there is a lot that's going on right now. One is a lot of POCs are really exhausted. So Amanda, you're right. Just going to other BIPOCs and saying join our board is probably not gonna work. We probably got to figure out like why other POCs in the past may not have stuck around in the first place, and that might be the key as to transformation. But at the same time, I also think that the sort of conversation around DEI has started evolving now, where it is no longer about training. It is no longer about just having more of these conversations anymore. I think we are moving towards having these sort of like, what is, and actually this is exactly what Creating the Future is trying to do, which is like, what is the society we want to live in? And right now the conversation is like, well, we need to have no more cops in our schools. We need to decrease their budget by 50% so they are not killing Black people as much anymore. We have to start thinking about wages and the effects of the pandemic on people of color and how it's been hurting Indigenous and Black and Latinx folks and so on. So I think we have to start kind of framing it, which is like, why are we doing this and how will it actually help the movements, the society that we are in? How will we actually get to defunding the police? What is Creating the Future's role in that, in this sort of society we want to live in? Because right now, I feel like a lot of people of color are getting very tired of white folks kind of sitting around and saying, "Hey, we want to be okay with being uncomfortable around." And I actually had a conversation with a group of funders a while ago, mostly white again, because they're funders. And one of them it's about funders and racial equity. And the first hour was just them talking about like how they're going to be more comfortable with discomfort around all this stuff. And I said, I don't care whether you're comfortable with discomfort or whether you're centering whiteness or whatever. The fact is, you've been talking about centering or decentering whiteness for the last several decades, and funding is still not going to communities of color-led organizations. So right now, for a lot of people of color, we would rather have an all-white board who is moving money to communities of color-led organizations than a diverse board who is not. So I think that is something that we need to consider. It's like, okay, let's talk about Creating the Future's diversity or lack thereof. But is that what people of color really want? Or do we really want that Creating the Future to be the catalyst to move funding or resources or power to the communities that are most affected by systemic injustice? And be okay with people saying, you know what, you guys are not very diverse. And that is just kind of one of the hits we might have to take. Or we can go and try to, or we can do it simultaneously, trying to get more diversity on our board or whatever it is. But I think kind of what is our role in the movements in creating a post-pandemic world is kind of what we need to think about. And will we get there with the composition and strategies that we have currently? Sorry, that's really rambly.
No, not it wasn't, Vu. It really wasn't. You hit on something for me that I think is really important, which is it's truly understanding the impact of what we do in such a deep way. Like are we and I can only sort of frame it in my own life, but how I think about it with organizations too, which is, yes, so when we have these conversations, I think I want something that you're talking about, which is I want to make sure that it's affecting the systems level kinds of things and is honest to that. And so I will call out all the time, and I do it all the time. Shopping from Amazon is not an equitable, socially just thing to do. It just is not. If we really care about this, we're going to ask those questions about how are resources being allocated, who's making decision, who has money, who has power. And I think, yeah, if we can understand how, one, we frame creating the future and its approach around that, and it's really hard to do. I mean, it's really hard to be in a pandemic and say, I'm not going to shop from Amazon. And I'm sharing my own biases around this, but I feel like my own frustration comes when I see that, which is conversation over here. I think this is what I'm hearing you say, Vu, is a conversation about what equity and justice looks like, and then behavior over here that seems to be totally oblivious to what's actually happening on a day-to-day basis. It's like sort of this day-to-day reconciliation. And so I guess what I'm saying is I want this conversation to call me out, to call the organization out, to call the practices out, so that they're affirming of equity and justice, like within, because we talked about the role of this board is integrity. Sorry, you didn't ramble, Vu. You obviously triggered something in me. So
I'm both Vu and Amanda. I'm really, really grateful for you. This is personal. This is how we be. This is how we be as an organization. I'm coming back again, Justin, to the relationship thing. And the reason I guess that struck so much for me, and I'm going to be very open here. This is a second marriage for both Dimitri and me. I had a horrible marriage. I had an abusive marriage. I was a single mom who broke from a bad relationship with a 6-year-old in tow. I lived by myself for 20-something years, perfectly well, figuring out that nobody had control over me, and I did. And Dimitri left his marriage, which had been difficult, 5-7 years ago, and we've been together a very short time, considering that we have been business partners and best friends for about 700 years. And we are constantly in conversation about what it means to be in a relationship, because that's so important to both of us. And so I guess that's why it really struck me, Justin, when you talked about this is like marriage. You don't just say, okay, we're married, that's it, it's done. We're in constant conversation about what that means. And so there's a piece there that's really deeply resonating for me in terms of how do we be with each other? What systems do we set up in how we be with each other, which allow us to have whatever conversations need to happen because we're in relationship with each other. And we're really in relationship, whether we are talking about issues of gender, whether we are talking about issues of race, or whether we are talking about issues of what is going to be discussed at the staff meeting. We're in relationship with each other. And so that piece is really resonating for me. Vu, I adore you. You know, our whole mission is systems change. Our whole mission is systems change. Is if we change the questions we ask, what are the changes that create in systems? The future we are stepping into for this organization, this movement, is we're no longer going to be teaching. We're going to distribute the teaching so that other people can teach this, because if we're the only ones teaching, then it comes through our lens, and B, how far can the mission reach? But the other big piece that we're stepping into, and Vu and I have talked about this, is actually advocating for systems change of how social change is done. Of how much of social change is counterproductive. The social change systems are counterproductive. So that's resonating with me for what this conversation can make possible. And I'm also reflecting on the fact that when I first heard someone from Black Lives Matter speak, right after Ferguson, so it was right after folks started coming together, in this very, very visible way that we're seeing now. What struck me, and I think it might have been a conversation on NPR, but it was so, you know, it was many years ago, was the interviewer was saying something about, well, what does the movement want? And you sort of expected something that had to do with race or with police or whatever. And this woman just started down the list. We want education. We want healthcare. And it just went down the list of all of the systems that need to change that did not, quote unquote, have to do with racial equity, but have everything to do with racial equity. That if people don't have healthcare, then how can we talk about justice? And if people don't have equitable education systems, how can we talk? And it just went down the list. And that struck me, Vu, when you were talking, that this is about the systems that need to change. And it also is about the personal relationship and how, so everything that you all are saying is just sort of deeply resonating in my head right now. So when you're asking, Justin, you know, what the conversations can make possible, I guess if I were to hone down, you think you were rambling, Vu? If I were to hone down my rambling, it is sort of clarifying what our purpose is. Back to what Vu said, you know, what is our purpose? What are we trying to accomplish as an organization? And clarifying what our purpose is, and how we intend to be in relationship with each other inside of that. And now I'll stop babbling.
I'll jump in by thinking about that issue with relationship and building relationships, and also this issue of when working towards being an anti-racist in various, as an individual, as an organization. And what I keep coming back to is, and I think kind of connects to what Justin and everyone was saying, who was saying earlier, but we need time. No, we need time to do that, but we also don't need time to do that in a way, right? Because we've been talking about it for a long time. But we do need time to actually implement the change, right? To be, so for example, to not buy Amazon, which is really easy to do in the middle of the night, right? Like it's part of my, like, and then really think through, like, what does it mean to not do that anymore? And how do I change so that I am doing the anti-racist option of where I buy things, you know, and what I do, and building these relationships that we need to do, as Amanda was talking about, not just going up to some random person and saying, hey, be on the board, but taking time to build relationships with people. It takes time, and so we need to somehow make that time like we do with other things. Like, I don't know, even I know when I do my research time, I have to actually schedule it in. You know, maybe this is some of those things of like, okay, what, you know, let's make sure I leave time for just doing this work, because it's so important, like that it has to be done. I need to make time to do it, just like I, you know, exercise time, just like research time, whatever. Of course, ultimately, hopefully you get to a place where it's just ingrained, but, you know, well, at least I have been, you know, indoctrinated for a long time, and so trying to move out of that. is going to take a lot energy, time, thinking, all those things.
So, and I'm certainly not going to capture all of these, but if we shift that and think about if we are going to have a conversation that moves us towards clarity of what integrity to justice and equity outcomes means, if we're going to have a conversation that clarifies a path to system change that reinforces equity and social justice, one that honors relationships and helps us learn how to be present in this kind of conversation ongoing. I think a conversation that leads us to understand how creating the future is contributing to the systems change. I think to some of what Vu's point is. What do we need? What will it take for us to be able to have that conversation?
Some time.
Some time.
Scheduling time. Blocking off time to have an intentional educating ourselves and us talking.
Mm-hmm. Say more, Angie, about educating ourselves. Is there something for you, again, sort of us collectively, that you're calling us to learn? Or,
yeah, and I should say
about?
ourselves, or at least myself. I mean, I've been trying to read a lot of stuff lately that's trying to help me understand things in a different way. You know, like the work on anti-racism, how to be anti-racist, stamped from the beginning. You know, all those kinds of that kind of work. There's a lot of good lists out there, and just kind of systematically learning a new discourse, new history, and a new history to me, or unknown history to me, I guess I should say. It's not new to a lot of people. Things that I wasn't taught or didn't seek out on my own. But now I've become more aware of, to try to educate myself so that I have a better understanding of what the things are. Not that I am any expert or ever maybe will be, but it's certainly is I think important place to start.
Thanks, Angie. What else do we need? What else will it take for us to be able to...
I will jump in and say I think Angie's right about the sort of the educating ourselves stuff. I mean, we can't, again, sorry, a bit of a cliche, but we can't just expect other people to teach us and expect them to do all the carrying of us. But yeah, sorry, I'm going to contradict myself now. I do worry again that for us to have better conversations, we can't just have conversations about. We need to have conversations with. Yeah, sorry.
I think with Carl, what you're saying, the conversations with, and Angie, you're talking about the education, and I was sort of taking away from some of the education pieces, the blinders that we have of not seeing impacts and how systems are structured, that I do think that part of that learning, and I don't know if that is, we need to bring into the space something that helps us, because we're talking about systemic change. like I think we need to deepen our understanding of disadvantageous systems. And I know, Vu, you hit on that a lot. You're really good at sort of highlighting, like, do you see what this does? That's not what we want, but because I do think that there's sometimes we miss how, I mean, even to Vu's point, which is the shift from DEI conversations, it's like, okay, well, the conversations about DEI didn't seem to do much. So maybe diversity isn't actually the issue. The issue is something else that if we want to see the needle move a little bit more, or a lot more. Sorry.
So Justin, to give you an example, I'm going to talk about Vu's favorite topic, possibly his second favorite topic now, which is funding and foundations. Sorry, Vu, I wasn't sure if it was governance or funding, but there you go. So I've been part of something in response to sort of COVID that's been about emergency funding of the sector, and a huge amount of money has become available, and a number of us were arguing that it's really important that these emergency funds are targeted, especially at the communities that are most marginalised, because they have been most affected by COVID in the UK, as I presume they have in the US as well. And long story short, but we've not nearly received as many applications as we should have done, or we thought we would do, from the most marginalised communities for those funds, despite us saying that we really want to target them. And whilst on one level I know that that's our fault, as like the people who have been involved in sort of like trying to pull the funding together and so on, there is quite a sort of, I guess, a visceral sort of level. We just don't understand why the applications have been so low. And whilst I might sort of have ideas about that, it's not until I was involved in another group where we are specifically trying to set up a foundation at the moment, specifically to fund what you guys call people of colour, we call BAME, or Black and Minority Ethnic Organisations in this country. And you start to hear some of the stories about why people don't apply, and just how pissed off they are with foundations in this country and sort of the funding system. So I guess when we talk about what needs to have, what is it that we need to have that better conversation, we need to have, as part of the conversation, people who really are excluded by current systems, so that we can start to think about how do we not just, well, Hildy, what's the language that quote you used the other day? It's not just about changing the system that we've got, but how do we reinvent new systems to replace the ones that we've got? How do we come up with that new paradigm? And I take Vu's point that, it's not as simple as just let's get some people of colour onto the board, but you do have to hear people's stories about how just here, the systems that we talk about in this sort of professional language and at times academic language, what it means to them, what it looks like to them. And I think that's what you need to sort of shift the conversations.
And one of two thoughts are occurring to me, and I apologize if my head is down. I think best when I'm writing. Years ago, I mean, it could be a decade ago. I think the last time I updated my board recruitment book was over a decade ago. So I think it's in there. So let's say 15 years ago. When the sector was talking about board diversity, that was always what it was. Board diversity is how we were always talking about it. And I had done a lot of writing and conversation about the fact that board diversity leads to tokenism. We need a green guy and a blue woman and a red person with green eyelashes, and we need one of each. And you go to your Rotary and you go to your club and see if you can find that green person and see. And what occurred to me at that time was that lack of diversity is a sign of lack of engagement, and that engagement, real engagement with the communities that we serve, whether this is a food bank, whether this is Creating the Future, whether this is whomever, if those communities are deeply engaged in decision-making in every conversation, then they will be present throughout. And that it doesn't start with, we need 2 green people on the board. It starts with, how are we engaging as an organization in the community? How are we creating programs for? Are we creating programs with? Are we working hand in hand with community? And that if we're deeply engaged, community members will be at all levels of it. They'll be volunteering. We'll be able to look at those volunteers and say, oh, wow, Susie's really good and Joey's really good, and we want them to be, and it bubbles up. What we were so used to thinking about with boards is that it starts with a CEO and a board president going out and recruiting people, rather than, and they're going to recruit people that they know, which is most likely going to be people that look like them and sound like them. And if instead we look at the board as the last step, not the first step, but that it comes from engaging the community, then things bubble up, and that it starts to look like that. So that's one thought that's occurring to me, is that in terms of what do we need to have the conversation be effective, is that this is not a board top down. Again, like Justin said, we're here just to ensure that we're walking with integrity, and we've built a model intentionally where leadership is going to come from the people who are actually doing the work. So it's ensuring that the people doing the who are the people doing the work, ensuring that we're inviting, and that we're creating an environment. So for me, the high potential of the conversation is that we're creating an environment that the people doing the work, that are making the decisions, that are doing the leadership, that are on the ground, are representative of the community we serve. And that community happens to be the world. Okay, so what does that mean? So I think there's a lot of structural questions in there of the how do we do it, but it has to start at the bottom and not at the top. And I think that's a big piece for me. The other thing that I'm thinking about a lot is, in terms of conditions, what do we need? And this is why a big piece of what we're going to be advocating for as we move into stage 2 of Creating the Future is a huge advocacy role for blowing up every single thing about social change and starting over again. You know, some of you have seen the slide share that we have up about the Sisyphus, about the fact that social change is all about pushing that rock up the hill and hoping that when it falls down, it doesn't land on our heads. And I've been having conversations with foundations and other leaders in the world for about a year about the fact that there is nothing about the systems for social change that everything about the systems for social change is ineffective. When we look at everything from the hierarchical structures of organizations, Vu, you were talking about starting out as a movement, the hierarchical structure of organizations, to how we plan as organizations, to, of course, not only how the funding comes in, but how we resource in the first place. The fact that we talk about evaluation is for learning, but God forbid I share what we learn in our organization with the organization next door, because their learning's in a silo and somebody else's learning is in a silo. Every single system we encounter in social change encourage us to be individuals, organizations, and oh yeah, by the way, we're here to create change, but mostly we're here to make sure the organization is sound and corporate and so to me, a big condition for our success in this bottom-up sort of equity and justice that has to happen is that we see the systemic failings in absolutely every system of social change. And that it's not just funding. It is every single thing about how social change is imagined. And it is not that social change organizations have become white male centric. They started out that way. We started out with church charity, so go back 500, 1,000 years. We started out with robber baron charity. We started out with doing for because those poor people, because we're building railroads and making them poor, you go through the whole history. We started out like that. And so the systems that have been created are all rooted in that. And so I'm just feeling very, very strongly that one of the big conditions, and then I'll stop babbling, is that we need to see that every single system in social change is absolutely set up to do exactly what it's doing, to keep people in power. And I'm done now, I'm sorry.
Hey everyone, it's Boo again. Round 2 rambling. So let's begin. And this one is even more rambly, which I do think that it's important for us to have this conversation. And at the same time, I do think we had to kind of confront like some of the anger and frustrations, not necessarily directed at creating the future, but at the movement in general, as you've named, Hildy, about how, I mean, a lot of people of color have been bringing up things and they've experienced a lot of trauma. And I don't want to discount creating the future. I personally have benefited from working with you, Hildy, and with this group. The community-centric fundraising movement has benefited. I really appreciate your leaning towards like not having incrementalism, but actually having a vision for what we want and to work towards that, because so much of the field is very incremental. I think a challenge and something we might want to wrestle with is the fact that in many ways, a lot of communities of color have been doing a lot of catalytic thinking for a long time. And it has been squashed by powers and funders and so on. And this happens quite a lot, right? If we think about this catalytic thinking, a lot of communities are thinking about like the defund the police movement is extremely catalytic, right? And of course, as soon as that happens, people are like, oh, well, you know, you can't do that. That's really because it's led by people of color. And this has happened quite a lot where people, BAME or BIPOC communities have been saying like, this is what we want and this is how, and then it gets completely ignored. And then white folks come along and say, well, this is what we think this is, we're going to call it collective impact or whatever it is. And then funders are like, oh, that's amazing. Yeah, totally. Let's do that. So I do think that we had to kind of figure out like what is, again, the role of creating the future, because I do see there is some really important work here. How do we acknowledge the fact that many communities have been catalytic in their thinking for hundreds of years, but have just been neglected, or have just have been told that this doesn't work. And so I think that is something we have to think about kind of moving forward if we want to attract the people to do this work, because otherwise it's going to be, again, a group of mostly white folks telling people you need to be catalytic when they are like, well, we have been. And where are you? And why are you now taking credit for this or whatever? So I just want to throw that out there because I see the frustration from a lot of communities of color. I myself see it. And a lot of it is warranted. A lot of it is simply because of the trauma we've experienced of being told over and over that our ideas are not good enough until it has been sanctified by a white group or leader. And so that's something we have to grasp with as we try to figure out how do we actually build this working with people of color. So I think I'll just end there with the rambling for now.
Yeah, I'm resonating deeply with what you're saying, Brew. It's the thing that it's the push and pull that I have felt with catalytic thinking as a meme, as a genre, and to have been saying for years is that all I did was pull together what's already working to create change. And that I have personally been told, this is the first time in the past, I'm going to say 5 to 10 years, is the first time that I too was not patted on the head and said, that's very cute, but that'll never work, by people in power. When we first started exploring these approaches, 1998, 1999, we're talking 20 years ago, I was told flat out, and I'm almost quoting word for word, this vision stuff is very nice, Hildy, but we actually have to do real work. And so I'm getting it. And the thing that I kept saying over and over again, and have been saying, is, do you guys not read history? Like, the only thing that's ever changed anything is aiming for what's possible. And so I'm yeah, and I think part of okay, so if we're talking, what are the conditions, answering Justin's question from like an hour ago, what are the conditions that need to be in place? I think a big piece of it for our mission, okay, if our mission is systems change, is raising up the stories of over and over and over again, what has actually created change in the world? Who has actually changed the world? Because it ain't been white men. Who has actually changed the world? And where has that change come from?
Change for the better.
Yeah, hopefully.
Well, qualify that.
Hopefully. Yeah, no, you're right. But I think that might be a big piece of it, is making sure that we are constantly telling the stories of what history is and what really has changed the world.
Well, that could be one thing that we can really think about doing that would move us towards the sort of action and change, is lifting up what has been working, as you said, Hildy. And that's going to be from a lot of women of color and the work that they have been doing that may not get the spotlight. And that might be one of the things that we do as Creating the Future, is doing that. And it's the same struggle I've been having community-centric fundraising. People are like, Vu, you get all the credit. I'm like, no, I'm just aggregating what women of color and other fundraisers of color and also white allies have been saying is what's wrong with fundraising, right? So that is also a struggle that I have to work with, is, we got to lift up the voices of others. And apologies, everyone. I also have to go. I appreciate this conversation. I appreciate you all and the thoughtfulness that everyone has been putting into this. And I look forward to the next time.
Sorry, can we get some quick reflections from folks who are going? What is standing out to you from the conversation?
Yeah, Carl and Boo.
I haven't resolved in my mind the desire for large-scale structural change with the contrary desire to just get shit done and start changing things. And Vu's first contribution sort of cut through it quite well for me. And I'm not expecting anyone here to have that answer, but it's just something I'm struggling with sort of in my working life and sort of trying to get on with, because I think you are all right that you have to try and replace the system. You've got to have something better than just incremental change, just sort of what you do, and so trying to find ways to sort of do that is hard. I do think the point then about elevating people sort of at the front line who are doing stuff differently, I think that's absolutely spot on. And one of the great things that I love about my work is that I come across people every day when I'm at work who are just doing amazing stuff in spite of the systems that we put in place to support them, not because of the systems that we put in place. So what I'm trying to work out with my job and our organization now is, how do we stop being the organization that's an umbrella above and sort of says, oh, we'll reach down and we'll sort of like showcase the best ones, and instead, how do we turn the umbrella upside down almost, so that we're a platform that people stand on, and how do we, what's the best way that we can sort of give them a voice? Because, people, as Vu has just said, there are people out there that have got the answers already. We've got to sort of just make sure that we sort of try and put them to the fore in what we do. I'm sorry I have to leave early, everyone. It's a bit earlier than I thought I was going to, but I want to stay and hear what Vu says.
Thanks, everyone. I think this is kind of what we have to do is think about what is our role in the movements that are coming in a post-pandemic world. And there is a huge battle for the soul of the world coming in November. And I know that's very American-centric right now. But if Trump is reelected, it's just gonna continue screwing up everything over here. So we have to think about that. And maybe Creating Future's role is kind of doing some work to give permission to lots of communities who have been doing this work, who have been catalytic, over hundreds of years, but have been told that that is not the way to do things, and have been shut down repeatedly, and to the point where we BAME and BIPOC leaders have started to believe it. And I meet lots of POCs leaders who are just like, who have really internalized this incremental thinking, even though they started being very catalytic years ago. And then the system keeps wearing them down over and over and over again. And now maybe this is our role, is to figure out how we can find these originally catalytic leaders and give them permission again to be catalytic, and to lift up those leaders and find them the resources and give them the strength to do their work and to be as catalytic as they have been, or they have potential to be.
Thank you, Vu and Carl. We know you guys gotta pop off. Really appreciate you being here. Thanks a lot.
Thank you, everyone. Appreciate you all.
Bye.
Bye, everyone.
I have one response, and it's too bad that Vu's hopping off, that so much of oh, Hilda, you said my video is frozen. Let me see. Does that come back on? My webcam does that every once in a while. Sorry. Thank you for sharing that. One of the things that I think is so powerful to me around catalytic thinking in general is the values, being explicit about values and holding those up. And I think so much of what we see is professed values do not align with the actual values that people are acting on. And so I think a lot of the frustration that Vu was talking about, the system stuff, is, the whole notion that, culture eats strategy for lunch. It does. The problem is the culture that's eating strategy for lunch is not the one that everyone says they value, the list on the walls. And I think that's fundamentally what's wrong, is that we are not calling bullshit on what's valued when we observe the systems and the actions. And I think that catalytic thinking and creating the future has an opportunity to call BS because of the nature of how we say it's important. And sort of, I think even maybe to some of what you were saying, Hildy, with your frustration and anger of the things being broken. Well, what's broken is that the system doesn't align with the values that we say we're trying to advance. Everyone will say, whether they believe them or not, that's another issue. But everybody will say, yes, we want racial justice, we want equity, but they don't actually act on those values in the design and decision-making that's there. And I think that we do actually have an opportunity to demonstrate the inconsistency, to demonstrate how systems fail when that process of visioning and valuing isn't taken seriously. It's just done as like, well, we did that. And, when I ask people, like, what would it look like to measure your organization's value success in the same way that you measure financial success, they always look at me like, that's the craziest idea in the whole world. Who would do that? You can't do that. That's impossible. That's qualitative. But it's like the fact that we don't even do that. So I think our conversation, if we can think about how to do that, and I also think then part of what we need to do for this conversation to be successful, one of the conditions is we need to sit in that space and define what we really mean it is that we value and will hold ourselves honest to when we're talking about racial equity and social justice and racial justice. Like we have to get down and say what, and I don't think that it's new, but it's reaffirming that means people experience X, Y, and Z. And I think if we have that, then we can make sure that our values align at least with that. So two parallel pieces. But as facilitator, I wanted to actually pause because we lost 2 people. And I'm concerned about us moving forward. Wow, that's really bad that I took the opportunity to say something and then I'm calling. So I want to give everyone an opportunity to share more on the conversation if there's something you feel like you want to say, but I also want to acknowledge that we lost 2 people and whether we want to, how much of the conversation we want to have in their absence.
Well, we only have 20 minutes left anyway. So having a time for reflection might.
And that was really my reflection, what I just gave.
Yeah. I like, Justin, that you brought it back to what we said our board is about, which is ensuring our integrity and ensuring our values. And so articulating what are those values, or re-articulating what are those values when it comes to this specific issue, I think is really important.
So let's take a moment. Folks, think about what we've talked about, what you're reflecting on, what you want to make sure is heard. What's presenting itself for folks?
I'll jump in just to, I guess, reinforce conversation that we've already had. But I'm learning in my own community that there are organizations doing work that I just had not really known about or heard about because I was in certain circles, and they're in other circles, especially people of color doing amazing work in our community. And so so part of the work needs to be like, again, raising awareness about what the issues are and who's doing what already. And then I really love the idea of figuring the voices or the work of people that have already doing this work. And instead of me as a white person coming in and saying, here's what needs to happen, right? But to be a background supportive role. And so figuring out what is that supportive background kind of ally role would be most helpful is sort of where I am right now in my own sort of local community context. And so thinking about that in relation to creating the future and what that looks like, I think would be not only finding those stories, raise them up, I think, but what are the other things we can do to be supportive of that work.
Amanda, Dimitri?
Okay, go ahead.
A few things are standing out, and I'm sorry if I haven't been participating as deeply as I would have liked to here. And I'll get into the tech stuff at some other point. What stands out with me are 2 things. One was Vu's comment about energizing existing leaders who may have entered their movement life being catalytic and thinking in this broad term, and then having it sort of beaten out of them. And that's sort of standing out to me as kind of an important pivot point existing leaders and how to speak in a language which continues to motivate or re-energize them. But that also brought up another thought, and that is the whole idea of safety for not only the existing oppressed, for a better word than that, but also for the leadership of organizations. Oh, we're trying to do this. The sort of 6 white people who said that making decisions in an organization. What prevents them is what I'm thinking about from being more open. What prevents them from being not just more open, but from radically changing their relationship with themselves and the organization and communities that they serve. And so I'm just I've been pondering that and thinking about that. And the other, and this sort of popped up in the course of the conversation here when Vu was talking about defund the police. I think the power of language is really, really important, and that how we phrase things makes a huge difference in how people react to it. And I know I've commented to Hilda before, the words defund the police sounds like there's no police. And if you don't understand what those words mean in the context of the environment that they're in, it paints different pictures to different people. And so I think it's very important to be clear in not only the language, but the definition of that. And if what we're talking about is take funding where the police are doing work that they're not qualified for and put that funding into people who are qualified. That's a lot of words, but that's a very different image than there is no police, and in terms of how people feel about that. So those are things that this conversation brought up to me in terms of areas that we can be thinking about is, and Catalytic thinking does it beautifully in terms of language and whatnot. How do we address what's out there in the world as well? Not only our own language and our own thinking, but what we come up against.
Well, I'd like to thank you for just extending this invitation, and I was very excited. One of my coworkers, I think, was on the catalytic funding or creating funding change conversation, and I've been following you on Facebook, and I've been getting your newsletter. So when I saw an opportunity where a board was going to be wrestling with these issues and moving forward, and that it would be an open meeting, I thought that was great, that I could maybe pick up a few tips. I think, and so I will continue to follow you and reflect. I think a way to highlight catalytic organizations that you could do organically, not that you're asking for advice, would be on social media, just like when you see something, share it. And also maybe like an inclusion in the newsletter, just, this organization does this amazing stuff. I think when you get to the point where you're talking about what, Dimitri, when you talk about how other organizations or other movements have chosen a catchphrase, like when you talk about that's not the right choice of words, then I think that gets into white-splaining another movement. And I know, I'm guessing, I know it's coming from a good place of wanting to have people be effective, or what, have how you would perceive them to be more effective. But so I would just put that there for you to think about. It's not our place to change someone else's slogan when it's clearly effective because it's on everybody's tongues, even though. So I just want to throw that out there. But mostly just I hope to be able to continue learning from you all as you on your walk.
Well, thank you, Amanda, for being present, participating. Appreciate it. Hildy, any further?
Yeah, lots of stuff that's just sort of bouncing around. Vu's comments about having catalytic thinking beat out of people. I'm again reflecting so much on thinking about what happens in Indian country and just thinking about the fact that language and culture were literally beat out of them systematically for their own good. That one of the things that in my study early on when we were spending a lot of time in Indian country, which by the way is a nomenclature they use, so that's not mine, is that little known to outsiders, reservations, tribes, sovereign nations were given the right to have treaty rights with the US, negotiate with the US. Anything they have came with many strings, but one of those strings is that they were forced to adopt democracy. So the only way that they could negotiate, the only way that they could be a sovereign nation within the United States was if they adopted something that looked like the US Congress. And what that meant was giving up the way they culturally made decisions and forced the way we culturally made decisions upon them. And so I'm thinking a lot about what does that mean to a culture when every single aspect of how you have been dealt with is to take away how you think and the lens through which you see the world, and to say our lens is the only correct lens. So that's resonating with me, which sort of leads to some of the things that we've been talking about in terms of raising voices, raising stories. I'm always thinking of podcasting. I'm always thinking, quite honestly, of syndicating a show on community radio. So I'm glad you're here, Amanda. But the thought that occurs to me is that there's a lot of conversation going on right now that is very preaching to the choir. That the people who are having the conversation are the people who are likely to have the conversation. The people who are already open to questioning their own whiteness, their own racism, their own issues. They're already having the conversation in their head, or they're ready. And thinking about the continuum of potential and the fact that they're at a point where they're ready to start having that conversation. What does it take to open people's eyes to a different way of seeing who are not in the choir? And so that's sort of percolating for me. Again, if we're about systems change, what systems? That's percolating for me. And really, the emphasis on systems change and the emphasis on going upstream with the systems change, because a lot of what we're fighting doesn't start with us. A lot of what we're fighting starts upstream, and we just keep carrying it forward. We're in that boat and we're just like, yeah, we're rowing in that direction, but it's starting up here. And so there's a big piece of this for me, and this is a conversation that I know I'm going to be ruminating on. So this is just like sort of top of mind stuff, but there's a lot of ruminating. How about you, Justin? Anything in addition? I also want to when you asked for reflections, you asked, is there anything you want to make sure is heard? I love that question. So I just wanted to thank you for that.
You're welcome. Well, and that was partly because I made myself heard, and I wanted to make sure everybody else got a chance to be heard too. I think the biggest thing that sort of stood out with me was sort of Vu's comment on, it doesn't really matter what you look like if it matters what you're doing and how you're, I don't care if the board's all white if you're if you're creating systems that are equitable, you know, we can worry about your internal system a little bit later. Like that's, I mean, it was interesting because it sort of, it reprioritized, which is why I think it's so important we consider like what it is that we value externally and think about what's going on outside that we influence as opposed to what's the diversity look like in here. That will, I mean, that requires intentionality too, and continuing the relationship building. But, you know, that's totally missing the forest for the trees, I think. Is sort of what I'm taking away from that. And, you know, I really do. I think that this is one of those places where it is just so crystal clear, you know, impact trumps intent. Or, you know, it doesn't matter what you intended to do. What matters is the impact that it's having. Because, and that's part of what I feel like I'm constantly doing is I'm reconciling my intent, because I might have thought I had good intent, but if it had been bad impact and bad, you know, then I got to revisit it. I don't understand something, because if I thought it was good intent and it had a negative impact, this, I think, Angie, goes to your point of what is it that I don't know about what I think is good or what I think is important. So, so I think all of that is important to make sure that we feel like we can move forward and act on things. And us individually, and I do, yeah, I do walk away sort of thinking for us, our next kind of piece of this conversation is reaffirming those values that truly matter in this context. And then speaking to how we can elevate, validate catalytic thinking as a tool to advance equity and justice, and being advocates for it in a way, I think, as Vu said, that, you know, people are being heard and action is actually happening. And yeah, I mean, again, I sort of go back to the values. I'm like, the BIPOC community actually is really good at knowing what they value and sticking to it. It's the only, it's a way to survive. Like, and we need to demonstrate that we can do that too. That we can hold values that are beneficial and follow through on them.
And as the role that we've chosen for this board, as sort of setting the guidelines of re-articulating the values when it comes to this, and what will it take for us to ensure that that is actually happening as the organization grows, as the arms get more varied and they're further and further away. I think that's going to be a huge next piece of the conversation. If we were gonna start out as an integrity board with a first conversation, I think this is a really, really, really good one to be our first. Thank you, Justin, for facilitating this.
You're welcome.
Yeah, thank you, Justin.
And Amanda, thank you for being here and for all the work that you're doing. It's pretty awesome.
Yes.
Pretty awesome. I'm a big fan of yours all, so it goes both ways. Thank you. Thank you. Yeah.
I was just going to say, can we confirm our next date is September
14, second
14?
Monday. Second Monday.
Okay.
We have, yeah.
Does that work?
Got it.
Yeah, it works for me. What are we, yeah, what's our homework for next, for our next meeting? Do we have any?
I think Justin really said it. You know, really looking at maybe going back to our values that are articulated in multiple pages at our website, but reaffirming what do our values mean when it comes to this particular issue of equity and justice, and then looking at, okay, so if the board's role is to ensure we're walking the talk of our values, what does that mean in action? What does the board do?
Sounds
And there
good.
might also be, I think, a question of how do we, and perhaps it is the process of doing that, but really asking in what ways are we amplifying those values and reinforcing them through
Yes.
through the work of the organization or the network.
Yes.
Exploring that, or at least articulating our own expectations of what that would look like.
Yeah.
Because again, we're not the doers of it, but nor the deciders, but I think we can clarify expectations.
Yeah. Yeah. Awesome. And
Sounds good.
Dimitri, do you want to just do a quick report in on what's going on with it, if anything, with the technology? Are we streaming? Have we been able to? We've not been able to.
Okay, we've not been able to stream, and there's a combination of things that changed at Zoom. I have been in a online chat almost through the whole meeting with their tech support, trying to figure it out because they were having an issue figuring it out as well. I think we have found what the issue is, and we have hopefully put into place things that will make it streamable in the future. And I've already talked to them. I'm going to set up some test webinars right after we're done and see if the streaming links appear. And so that we can avoid this. And I won't get into the tech as to what the issues are, other than this is a combination of things having to do with their upgrading their security and requiring certain things and making things default that weren't default before. So I think we've addressed them all. Unfortunately, I tried like a half hour ago, or even more than that, to see if I could implement those changes during the meeting and see if we could at least start streaming at that point. And it did not happen. And they weren't sure whether it would or wouldn't. So that's the status, and hopefully, and it's really extremely personally frustrating because the importance of this conversation not having been live and streamed. And Hilda, you're recording, which is thankful, because I've had to go in and out of the meeting in and out of this so many times as testing this, that at least we'll have one recorded copy, which will be uploaded to the website and people have access to. But so, long story longer, that's the status of it.
Thank you for doing it.
Great. Thank you, everyone.
Hey, thank you. See you guys in a month.